Welcome to third ALS List Fest Day 1. Today we have our guest of honor Dr. Pariksith Singh with us who will give us inaugural address today. So I will quickly introduce Dr. Pariksith Singh. Dr. Pariksith Singh is MD and a board certified internal medicine. Dr. Singh received his medical education at Savai Mansingh Medical College in Rajasthan, India, where he was awarded honors in internal medicine and physiology. Upon completion of his residency, Doctor Singh relocated to Florida and worked for several years before establishing Access Healthcare LLC in 2001. He has been our fearless leader ever since. Paishi Singh is first of all a poet and a philosopher, though not of any academic mold. He has evolved and is still evolving his own philosophy of life work which he has been articulating in terms is very personalized poetry and equally personalized medical practice. Whether healing a patient, running a business, or writing haiku, Paishi Singh is always looking for that perfect expression of the spirit in matter, and this is Paishi Singh's unique and consistent signature in all his works. Pariksith Singh's literature is the articulation of the inner quest for the spirit's perfection in matter, and therefore an expression of the eternal struggle of all forms to attain the supreme fluidity of content, and content to attain the perfect expression in form. Thus, you will find in Pariksith Singh's writing his poetry, short stories, literary critiques, and prolific translations from Hindi, Sanskrit, Persian, and Urdu, a strikingly original and creative interplay of form and content, technique and narrative, style and substance, and equally you will find an utterly contradictory, puzzling, and sometimes comic juxtaposition of the poetic and the ridiculously mundane. So, without taking more time, I will humbly request Dr. Pakshi Singh to address our esteemed audience. Over to you, sir.
Namaskar. Thank you for inviting me here for the Asian Literary Society Lit Fest, the third Lit Fest. And I'm honored to be part of a movement that I feel is so critical to our development as a people, as a nation, as a global community. And today I wanted to talk about something that seems to be evolving in our national awareness, not only in India, but also globally. And we are seeing a movement of what is unique about India, Indian darshana, Indian culture, Indian climate, Indian habits, Indian mannerisms, Indian languages, the idiom of India, if I may use the phrase, how it is affecting the idiom of English. And I've been reading some anthologies lately, and I'm seeing an interesting critical appraisal by our literati, and they seem to feel that anything written before 1947 was not English literature at all. So we are seeing it's a very unique thing which I have not seen in any culture except India, is that as soon as we became independent, we became post-colonial, we adopted the mentality of our sahibs and we became the brown sahibs. And it has taken us about 70 years to slowly rid ourselves of that inferiority complex that we have adopted as products of the Macaulay system of education, products of a a mentality that was always trying to impress the British or those who spoke English. And we adopted so much of the West with such zealousness that we became more westernized than even the Western poets. For example, if you look at the poetry after 1947, for almost 3, 4, 5 decades, most of our poets spent their precious time criticizing everything that had been done in the past and then aping T.S. Eliot or Ezra Pound. Meanwhile, the Western world had moved on beyond Eliot, and Eliot, of course, is a great poet. American poetry had moved on. European poetry, especially British poetry, had newer poets, newer style. There was a postmodernistic phase, but we clung to it. And a very descriptive phrase was used for us, for our poetry, that was a copycat poetry of the British style. And the allegation, the phrase used derisively was that we are Matthew Arnold's in a sari. I think as we extend it, we became T.S. Eliot's in pajamas. And T.S. Eliot himself, being a great poet, loved India, brought Indian philosophy, Indian darshana into his greatest works, including the Wasteland, including the 4 quartets, especially the dry salvages. And we, in an effort to become T.S. Eliot, shunned everything that we had. However, there is a time for everything, and perhaps it was needed for us to reject the past and discover ourselves anew. And I feel over the last decade or so, we are beginning to accept ourselves as we are. We have greater confidence in ourselves. And perhaps it's also the shyness or the extreme consciousness of our own sounds that made us nervous. The accent that we had, which is typically Indian, which is, of course, a lot of movies make fun of. If you see some of comedians, they make fun of our accents. But this hyper acute awareness of our accent kind of affected our poetry, and that's just my thought. We kind of shied away from the oral traditions of poetry, or maybe the oral tradition of poetry. The sound, the significance of rhythms and harmonies, we never could adapt into our English poetry for the last 50, 60 years. And the interesting thing that happened is poets who started in the Indian milieu, who wrote as prose poetry cut into pieces, wrote in a similar style, free verse, so-called free verse. When they moved to the US, they started becoming more disciplined, more refined, more formal. They started mastering the language. They started shedding their inhibition. And this attempt to impress the British public or the American public started falling away. We see that especially in A.K. Ramanujan. We see that in Aga Shahid Ali. We see that in Vikram Seth. And we see that that hyper awareness of them being Indian starts going away as they start becoming a part of the American society and American culture. In fact, what we see is Aga Shahid Ali drops his original vers libre poetry and starts using the traditional forms of Indian poetry like the ghazal, and he did a great job with it. Similarly, Vikram Seth became freer of his Indian past and wrote a great work, The Golden Gate, in sonnet form. The whole book, the whole novel, if I may use the term, is in sonnet form. So I think that tremendous awareness is going deeper now. As critics and as poets, we are realizing what is unique about us, what is unique about our own poetry, and what do we bring to the global stage. And now we are able to do it with confidence. We've had great novelists before, and I think our prose has shown the world that we are as good as anybody else. But also in poetry, we should not look down upon our achievements, which are remarkable. And to understand that, let us go in time, go back to who we are. If you look at, say, last few decades, we will see a culture of the mushaira, where in Urdu or Hindi language, we share the ghazals, the shairs, the different kind of kavitas with each other. Everybody sits together. There are connoisseurs, people listening. And when one shair starts the misra, the other one picks up the misra, what we call misra uthana. First line is picked up. Everybody's involved in it. Now, this is unique about us. This is not an American or English custom. And that is being brought into the English poetry. When Agha Shahid Ali writes a ghazal, he's bringing that rhythm, that sensibility into English poetry. This is our unique contribution. Now, if we go further back in our Sanskrit poetry, and in Sanskrit, we have had great poets, Valmiki, Vyasa, who are as great as Homer or Shakespeare, or Kalidasa, who is as great as a Dante or a Virgil, according to Sri Aurobindo. Because in Sanskrit, the language has been almost prepared to bring new harmonies, new rhythms, new meter, new chand, and to be able to catch those rhythms that are very deep in us, that are above our normal consciousness, what we call the superconscious states, states that we don't usually stay aware of, where the mind becomes quiet and we are able to listen things that we have not listened or that we have not heard, the occult, the spiritual. And our language, ancient languages, especially Sanskrit, could catch that rhythm. Now that rhythm has been brought into English with the genius of our poets, especially Sri Aurobindo, who did a great job, amazing revelation about first who we are, what is our poetry. He did a great linguistic research into what the Vedas meant, because we thought our Vedas were just priests worshipping gods to get gifts and pouring ghee or gifts into the fire. But he took us to the shlesha of each term that is used in the Veda. So the gau that we are asking for from Indra is not a cow. The gau is the ray of light. The gau is a higher awareness. And Indra is not a god sitting somewhere else. Indra is our own higher awareness. And fire is the divine within, where we, as the witness to our own divinity, start offering all our actions and everything we have to that inner purity. This is a yogic kriya, if I may use the word. So our first, to understand who we are, and Sri Aurobindo translated the Vedas, and we started becoming aware of what our great traditions were, how our ancients saw the world, and how they hid these great messages in Shlesha Alankar, what we call nowadays the puns, right? So the ghee is not just a purified butter, but the ghee is our purified awareness. Now, Sri Aurobindo brings this awareness to us so that we start awakening to our own possibility. And then the second great contribution he made to our understanding of who we are is a great interpretation of the Gita. And Swami Paramhans Yogananda has stated that it is the greatest translation in English of the ancient scripture that we had. It is with such deep understanding that it almost feels like Sri Krishna has come back and is describing his own grantha in the modern language. And that is all in English. To translate that Sanskrit knowledge into English is a tremendous feat, and we need to be aware of it. We need to accept it. We need to articulate it. And then the other great thing he did was to bring a new sound into English language, to prepare the English language, which was not capable of catching these sounds. He created his own theory, his own understanding, which was based on the genius of the English language, English sounds, and how the harmonies of Sanskrit can be brought into English. Just like Aga Shahid Ali much later brought the ghazal sound, the ghazal's wit, the two-liner, the sher, one after another, that form he brought in his later works before he passed away in 2001. Sri Aurobindo caught the Vedic and Upanishadic sound and brought it into English. And if we have time, then we will talk about it. So poetry is a high and ancient art, as Harold Bloom has so clearly stated and so beautifully said. At the end of it, the mode of poetry is consciousness, he says. And T.S. Eliot has said that poetry is the highest refinement of our consciousness. It is our greatest sensitivity. It is our best speech. He calls it the greatest intellectual activity to be able to study poetry and literature. And D.H. Lawrence has said, great poetry is that, or great literature is that, which changes your blood. So if we look at these great writers, what they are saying, we realize that this is what our genius already is. The meaning of our word kavi. Kavi does not mean a poet is one who is writing verse, but a kavi is one who can see through, he can see far, who can see. That seeing he's able to articulate, he's able to give a body to. Now we can see what he has seen. And in seeing what he has seen and what he has lived, our own awareness is transformed. Now, does this sound fantastic or a fanciful thing? Maybe. But for those of us who love poetry, it is the truth. When we read great poetry, we are changed. We are transformed. That is the power of our poetry. To that extent, our ancients took our chanda too. That is how seriously they took it. So poetry became a sacred art where my highest awareness invokes in you the highest awareness. That is our contribution to poetry. And when Sri Aurobindo writes it, and I can read it, if I read it to you, you will maybe catch that Upanishadic sound. You will see that, and that mantra, that highest possibility of the Shabda, of the Spandan that is brought, he experimented with it, and he articulated it to an extent that even our own critics could not understand. And I think we should acknowledge it, we should realize it, and we should play with it, just like a child plays with his toys, so that his consciousness is totally one with it. And if we can take that as not a serious thing, but as a joyous thing, which is what true poetry is, our awareness gets transformed. So for just a few lines, I would like to read and see if you can catch his sound. This is from his lines written in Savitri, and people usually pan his great epic. But listen to the sound and see what amazing transformation he brought into the English language. And he's talking about Shiva. So I think all of us can relate, and I'll just read 10 lines. A giant dance of Shiva tore the past. There was a thunder as of worlds that fall. Earth was overrun with fire, and the roar of death clamoring to slay a world his hunger had made. I saw the omnipotent's flaming pioneers over the heavenly verge which turns towards life, come crowding down the amber stairs of birth. I saw them cross the twilight of an age, the sun-eyed children of a marvelous dawn, the great creators with wide brows of calm, the massive barrier breakers of the world, and wrestlers with destiny in her lists of will, the laborers in the quarries of the gods, the messengers of the incommunicable, the architects of immortality. Now, if that sound can be caught, if you can hear that, then you will realize that he has brought a new meter into English. This is the next step after Milton. What Shakespeare and what Milton brought into language, into English, was a new way of feeling the language. They created the language while they created their work. And the challenge after Milton was, so massive was the architecture of his verse that most poets in blank verse either started imitating him or their blank verse seemed very pale in comparison to what Milton had written. Milton had tremendous power. Now, Sri Aurobindo, using our genius from Sanskrit, brings a new meter, brings a new sound into English. And that is an amazing step. And it may take decades, it may take a couple of centuries to realize what he did. And that's what happens with great art. But we must realize it, and we who understand our sounds, our Sanskrit, our rhythms, our chand, must be able to pick it up in the English language. The other thing he brought was he molded the English language. English language is based on accent and stress, but it has other elements too in its rhythm, which are quantity. See, in Sanskrit, the way we break our sur is laghu and guru. And laghu and guru depend on how long it takes to say the syllable or the akshara. So a is laghu, a is guru. In English, that's not how it works. In English, it is accent. It is how you roll it, right? I saw them cross the twilight of an age. It's just the turn, just the accent. Big difference in the languages. How do you bring that element? So we have to realize that even in English, we have longer sounds and shorter sounds, and they have their own background music, as it were. And if we start listening to it, we will start picking other harmonies. And with that, he created his own concept and theory of quantitative meter. And I will just read it to you how he brought that meter into English, which is based on more classical Greek poetry, but you will just enjoy it and see how his rhythm compared to, say, um, to be or not to be, that is the question, right? Listen to the length. To be or not to be, that is the question. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. Try to remember that. Now listen to this. An image from Sri Aurobindo. Rushing from Troy like a cloud on the plains, the Trojans thundered. Look at the length of the meter. Just as a storm comes thundering thick with the dust of kingdoms, edged with the devious dance of the lightning, so all Troas, loud with the roar of the chariots, loud with the vaunt and the war cry, rushed from Troywards gleaming with spears and rolled on enormous. The chand has changed. Now, if we can capture these notes that have been brought, then we can see the mastery that has been brought into English. Similarly, what Aga Shahid Ali did, and in my younger days, I also tried to capture the ghazal, because in English, the ghazal doesn't come out right? For the famous Ghalib ghazal, हर एक बात पे कहते हो तुम कि तू क्या है, तुम ही कहो कि ये अंदाज़े गुफ्तगू क्या है, right? How do you translate that? How do you translate that sound and that wit? कि तुम कह रहे हो कि तू क्या है, हर एक बात. So I tried it, and maybe I caught it. At every turn you ask me, who am I? At every turn you ask me, who am I? Tell me, is this the way to reply? Similarly, रगों में दौड़ने फिरने के हम नहीं कायल, रगों में दौड़ने फिरने के हम नहीं कायल, जब आंख ही से न टपका तो लहू क्या है. Now that rhythm has to carry through, the beher has to carry through, the matlas, the radif has to be there, the rhyme has to be there, the kafiya has to meet. So I tried, carrying the same rhythm. I am not one for coursing in the veins. I am not one for coursing in the veins. For what is blood if not cried from the eye? Now, if you see, if we can bring that meter, that wit, the tarkib, the kafiya, the matla, the makhta into English, then that's our contribution to the English language. The genius of the English language is advanced because we have brought our tehzeeb, our way of thinking and feeling into ghazal. Because ghazal is not just a dead form. The ghazal is a way of thinking and feeling, just like a sonnet. So every sher is independent. You create a zameen, and that on that difficult zameen, you play. Every sher is a new poem. And yet they are connected. And this was Shahid Ali's great contribution to the English ghazal. And I think we should all read about it. We should appreciate it. We should see what an amazing step it is for not only for our sensitivity, our sensibility coming into English, but for world literature. People before that, when they translated the ghazal into English, or they tried to write the ghazal into English, it was all free ghazal. They used to call it the bastard ghazal. It was really not a ghazal. Now, I know I'm running out of time, so I will take another few minutes if Manoj ji will allow it, and just quickly go over a few more contributions in our language, and hopefully we will start realizing our own value. And as we live our own value, as we live our own dharma, as we catch our own sounds from Tamil, from Sanskrit, from Hindi, in translation, not just anuvad, not just translating the meaning, but transcreation, bringing that spirit into English. And that, if we can do, I think that is the biggest contribution that we can make to English poetry. We cannot bring a contribution by aping English poets. We will be always secondhand. But if we are ourselves, if we realize our own dharma, right, as the Gita says, fight in your own dharma. If you fight in someone else's dharma, no matter how well you do, you're always going to be false. And Sri Krishna enjoins Arjuna to follow his dharma, not the dharma of a sannyasi, drop everything and run away. Follow your dharma, which is based on who you are, your swabhava, your swadharma. So I think if we realize our deeper movements, our subtler movements, then we will realize that our art is unique and special. Our idiom has its own beauty, and we need to have garva in who we are. Garva is not arrogance, but a quiet acknowledgement and the gentle pride in who we are. We've had some contributions, and I know Makarand Paranjape had brought literary history of Sarojini Naidu, Swami Vivekananda's poetry, of Sri Aurobindo's poetry, and those are beautiful works. Raja Rao, although Raja Rao is not a poet, but he's a great writer, bringing that Vedanta into our criticism. Sri Amal Kiran, one of the greatest critics that India has produced in poetry, who translated Blake and Mallarmé into English and showed that Blake's tiger was actually a symbol of Christ. Now that is a unique contribution. Nobody else had picked up on it, and we have not caught on to it. But Amal Kiranji went deep into the spirituality of Christ, which only we can do. We can go into that depth and realize the divinity of Christ and say, this is what Blake wrote, this is what he meant, this is what he was searching for. So I know I have run out of time. I can go on with this for hours, but translating ourselves into English, creating ourselves into English, is not something to be taken lightly, because poetry in its highest form is a yoga, is a sadhana. That's how those of us who love poetry see it. You put me in a library filled with these great poets and just leave me there for the next 20 years, I'm very happy. And those of us who love poetry will be very happy. Just keep us supplied with our great artists and poets. But we can not only transform our own awareness, we can transform the awareness of others by invoking our highest truth, our highest reality, the Sat that we are, constantly, always. And that is our message to the world. And if we can live that, then I think we will find that there is a continuity from pre-independence India to post-independence India, from the limited peninsula, please appreciate the pun, the peninsular India to the global India, and then to the global village, to the entire community. That unity, that bridging of the gap is our significant contribution. I appreciate you all. Enjoy the Lit Fest and just be happy with who we are and let's write great stuff. Let's be creative. Let's disrupt ourselves constantly, challenge ourselves, and go beyond our own horizons. Namaskar.
Thank you so much, sir, for such an insightful session. Definitely, it would be a very enriching experience for our audience. Thanks again for our inaugural session. Thank you, sir.
Namaste.